Shinano, named after the old province of Shinano, was an aircraft carrier built by the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II. Initially laid down as the third of the Yamato-class battleships, Shinano-Euro's partially complete hull was converted to a supercarrier in 1942, midway through construction. Over the next 2 years, the ship was heavily modified and she became the largest aircraft carrier built up to that time. Partially completed in November 1944, Shinano was sent from the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal to Kure Naval Base to complete fitting out and transfer a load of 50 Yokosuka MXY7 Ohka rocket-propelled kamikaze flying bombs. En route to Kure, she was sunk on November 29, 1944, 10 days after commissioning, by 4 torpedoes from the American submarine Archerfish. The ship carried an inexperienced crew, had serious design and construction flaws, and was not ready for combat. Over 1,000 of her crew and passengers were rescued, but 1,435 sailors and civilians died, including her captain. Shinano remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Design and description: one of 2 additional Yamato-class battleships ordered as part of the 4th Naval Armament Supplement Program of 1939, Shinano was named after Shinano Province, following the Japanese ship naming conventions for battleships. She was laid down on May 4, 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal to a modified Yamato-class design. Her armor would be 20 mm thinner than that of the earlier ships, as it had proved to be thicker than it needed to be for the desired level of protection, and her heavy anti-aircraft guns would be the new 65 caliber 10 ACM Type 98 dual-purpose gun, as it had superior ballistic characteristics and higher rate of fire than the 40 caliber 12.7 ACM Type 89 guns used by her half-sisters. Construction and conversion: as with Shinano-Euro's half-sisters Yamato and Musashi, the new ship's existence was kept a closely guarded secret. A tall fence was erected on 3 sides of the graving dock, and those working on the conversion were confined to the yard compound. Serious punishment up to and including death awaited any worker who mentioned the new ship. As a result, Shinano was the only major warship built in the 20th century to have avoided being officially photographed during its construction. The ship is only known to have been photographed twice, on November 1, 1944, by a Boeing B-29 Superfortress reconnaissance aircraft from an altitude of 9,800 meters, and 10 days later, by a civilian photographer aboard a harbor tug during Shinano-Euro's initial sea trials in Tokyo Bay. In December 1941, construction on Shinano-Euro's hull was temporarily suspended to allow the IJN time to decide what to do with the ship. She was not expected to be completed until 1945, and the sinking of the British capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse by IJN bombers had called into question the viability of battleships in the war. The Navy also wanted to make the large dry dock in which the ship was being built available, which required either scrapping the portion already completed or finishing it enough to launch it and clear the dry dock. The IJN decided on the latter, albeit with a reduced workforce which was expected to be able to launch the ship in 1 year. In the month following the disastrous loss of 4 fleet carriers at the June 1942 Battle of Midway, the IJN ordered the ship's unfinished hull converted into an aircraft carrier. Her hull was only 45% complete by that time, with structural work complete up to the lower deck and most of her machinery installed. The main deck, lower side armor, and upper side armor around the ship's magazines had been completely installed, and the forward barbettes for the main guns were also nearly finished. The Navy decided that Shinano would become a heavily armored support carrier carrying reserve aircraft, fuel and ordnance in support of other carriers rather than a fleet carrier. As completed, Shinano had a length of 265.8 meters overall, a beam of 36.3 meters and a draft of 10.3 meters. She displaced 65,800 metric tons at standard load, 69,151 metric tons at normal load and 73,000 metric tons at full load. Shinano was the largest aircraft carrier yet built, a record she held until the 81,000 metric ton Usa Forester was launched in 1954. She was designed for a crew of 2,400 officers and enlisted men. Machinery: Shinano Euro's machinery was identical to that of her half-sisters. The ships were fitted with 4-geared steam turbine sets with a total of 150,000 shaft horsepower, each driving one propeller shaft, using steam provided by 12 camp-on-water tube boilers. The ships had a design speed of 27 knots, but Shinano never conducted full-speed sea trials, so her actual performance is unknown. She carried 9,047 metric tons of fuel oil, which gave her an estimated range of 10,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. Flight deck and hangar: Shinano was designed to load and fuel her aircraft on deck where it was safer for the ship. Experiences in the battles of Midway and the Coral Sea had demonstrated that the existing doctrine of fueling and arming their aircraft below decks was a real danger to the carriers if they were attacked while doing so. Much of Shinano Euro's hangar was left open for better ventilation, although steel shutters could close off most of the hangar sides if necessary. This also allowed ordnance or burning aircraft to be jettisoned into the sea, something that the earlier carriers could not do with their enclosed hangars. The carrier's 256-meter flight deck was 40.0 meters wide and overhung her hull at both ends, supported by pairs of pillars. A large island, modeled on that fitted on Taya, was sponson off the starboard side and integrated with the ship's funnel. Much like the earlier Taya design, Shinano Euro's armored flight deck functioned as the ship's strength deck and copied British practices seen in their illustrious class carriers. Designed to resist penetration by 500-kilogram bombs dropped by a dive bomber, the flight deck consisted of 75 mm of armor plate laid over 20 mm of ordinary steel. It was equipped with 15 transverse arrestor wires and 3 crash barriers that could stop a 7,500-kilogram aircraft. 5 of these wires were positioned further forward to allow the ship to land aircraft over the bow in case the aft portion of the flight deck was unusable. Unlike the British carriers, Taya and Shinano had unarmored sides to their hangars. For stability reasons, the latter only had a single hangar that was 163.4 by 33.8 meters, with a minimum width of 19.8 meters aft, and had a height of 5.0 meters. The forward area of the hangar was dedicated to maintenance and storage facilities. Aircraft were transported between the hangar and the flight deck by 2 elevators, one at each end of the hangar on the center line of the flight deck. The larger of the 2 measured 15.0 by 14.0 meters. They were capable of lifting aircraft weighing up to 7,500 kilograms. The ship had an aviation gasoline capacity of 720,000 liters. Large ventilation fans were installed on the hangar deck to expel fumes in case of damage to the gasoline system. Taya had been sunk by an explosion of gasoline fumes. Canvas wind scoops would also be rigged over the elevator opening to force more air inside. The ship's organic air group was intended to consist of 18 Mitsubishi A-7M Reaper fighters, 18 AQB-7A Ryusei torpedo dive bombers, and 6 Nakajima C-6N Scion reconnaissance aircraft. The remainder of the hangar space would have held up to 120 replacement aircraft for other carriers and land bases. Armament: Shinano Euro's primary armament consisted of 1640 caliber 12.7 cm Type 89 dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts, 2 at each corner of the hull. When firing at surface targets, the guns had a range of 14,700 meters. They had a maximum ceiling of 9,440 meters at their maximum elevation of 90 degrees. Their maximum rate of fire was 14 rounds a minute. Their sustained rate of fire was around 8 rounds per minute. The ship also carried 105 Type 96-25mm light AA guns in 35 triple gun mounts. These 25mm guns had an effective range of 1,500 to 3,000 meters, and an effective ceiling of 5,500 meters at an elevation of plus 85 degrees. The maximum effective rate of fire was only between 110 and 120 rounds per minute because of the frequent need to change the 15-round magazines. This was the standard Japanese light AA gun during World War II. but it suffered from severe design shortcomings that rendered it largely ineffective. According to historian Mark Still, the weapon had many faults, including an inability to handle high-speed targets because it could not be trained or elevated fast enough by either hand or power, its sights were inadequate for high-speed targets, it possessed excessive vibration and muzzle blast. These guns were supplemented by a dozen 28-round AA rocket launchers. Each 12-centimeter rocket weighed 22.5 kilograms and had a maximum velocity of 200 ams. Their maximum range was 4,800 meters. 4 Type 94 high-angle fire control directors were fitted to control the Type 89 guns. The two controlling the portside guns were adjacent to their guns, while the starboard directors were mounted fore and aft on the island. They could control all of the forward and rear guns respectively as necessary. Type 22 and Type 13 air search radars may have been fitted. Armor: the ship's original waterline armor belt thickness of 400 mm was only retained where it had already been installed abreast the magazines, and reduced to 160 mm elsewhere. Below it was a strake of armor that tapered in thickness from 200 mm to 75 mm at its bottom edge. The flat portion of the armor deck over the machinery and magazine spaces, ranging from 100 to 190 mm, was retained, and the sloped portion that angled downward towards the bottom of the main armor belt was 230 mm thick. Large external anti-torpedo bulges below the waterline provided the main defense against torpedoes, backed up by an armored bulkhead extending down from the belt armor. The bulkhead was intended to prevent splinters from piercing the main hull and, though not watertight, was backed by a second one which was. The joint between the upper and lower armor belts was weak and proved to be a serious problem when struck by torpedoes. Even though Shinano Ava's tanks were protected by armor that could resist a 155 mm shell, the IJN attempted to isolate the tanks from the rest of the ship with a cofferdam. However, the investigation into the loss of Taiha had revealed that her Ava's tanks had sprung leaks after she was torpedoed. The resulting fumes then penetrated the cofferdam and exploded. Therefore the IJN thought it prudent to fill the empty spaces between the tanks and the cofferdam with 2,400 metric tons of concrete to prevent any fumes from escaping. Launching: the ship was originally scheduled for completion in April 1945. But construction was expedited after the defeat at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, as the IJN anticipated that the United States would now be able to bomb Japan with long-range aircraft from bases in the Mariana Islands. The builder was unable to increase the number of workers on Shinano and could not meet the new deadline of October. Even so, the pressure to finish as quickly as possible led to poor workmanship by the workforce. Shinano Ava's launch on October 8, 1944, with Captain Toshio Abe in command, was marred by what some considered an ill-omened accident. During the floating out procedure, one of the caissons at the end of the dock unexpectedly lifted as the water rose to the level of the harbor. The sudden inrush of water into the graving dock pushed the carrier into the forward end, damaging the bow structure below the waterline and requiring repairs in dry dock. These were completed by October 26. Commissioning and sinking: departure from Yokosuka. On November 19, 1944, Shinano was formally commissioned at Yokosuka, having spent the previous 2 weeks fitting out and performing sea trials. Worried about her safety after a U.S. reconnaissance bomber flyover, the Navy General Staff ordered Shinano to depart for Kure by no later than November 28, where the remainder of her fitting out would take place. Abe asked for a delay in the sailing date as the majority of her watertight doors had yet to be installed, the compartment air tests had not been conducted, and many holes in the compartment bulkheads for electrical cables, ventilation ducts and pipes had not been sealed. Nor had the fire mains or drainage systems been completed, as their pumps had not been delivered and the ship lacked portable submersible pumps. Most of the crew had seagoing experience, but they did not know how to operate the portable pumps on board. The escorting destroyers, Isokase, Yukikase and Hamakase, had just returned from the Battle of Leyte Gulf and required more than 3 days to conduct repairs and to allow their crews to recuperate. Abe's request was denied, and Shinano departed as scheduled with the escorting destroyers at 18 o'clock on November 28. Abe commanded a crew of 2,175 officers and men. Also on board were 300 shipyard workers and 40 civilian employees. Watertight doors and hatches were left open for ease of access to machinery spaces, as were some manholes in the double and triple-bottomed hull. Abe would have preferred to make the trip in daylight. He believed that waiting for a daylight passage would allow him extra time to train his crew and give the destroyer crews time to rest. However, he was forced to make a nighttime run when he learned the Navy General Staff could not provide air support. Shinano carried 6 Shinano suicide boats, and 50 Ohka suicide flying bombs. Her aircraft were not planned to come aboard until later. Her orders were to go to Kure, where she would complete fitting out and then deliver the kamikaze craft to the Philippines and Okinawa. Traveling at an average speed of 20 knots, she needed 16 hours to cover the 300 miles to Kure. As a measure of how important Shinano was to the Naval Command, Abe was slated for promotion to Rear Admiral once its fitting out was complete. Attacked. At 20:48, the American submarine Archerfish, commanded by Commander Joseph F. Enright, picked up Shinano and her escorts on her radar and pursued them on a parallel course. Over an hour and a half earlier, Shinano had detected the submarine's radar. Normally, Shinano would have been able to outrun Archerfish, but the zigzagging movement of the carrier and her escorts intended to avoid submarine attack inadvertently turned the task group back into the sub's path on several occasions. At 22:45, the carrier's lookout spotted Archerfish on the surface and Isakaze broke formation, against orders, to investigate. Abe ordered the destroyer to return to the formation without attacking because he believed that the submarine was part of an American wolf pack and that Archerfish was being used as a decoy to lure away one of the escorts to allow the rest of the pack a clear shot at Shinano. He ordered his ships to turn away from the submarine with the expectation of outrunning it, counting on his 2-knot margin of speed over the submarine. Around 23:22, the carrier was forced to reduce speed to 18 knots, the same speed as Archerfish, to prevent damage to the propeller shaft when a bearing overheated. At 2:56 on November 29, Shinano turned to the southwest and headed straight for Archerfish. The submarine submerged 8 minutes later in preparation to attack. Enright ordered his torpedoes set for a depth of 10 feet in case they ran deeper than set. He also intended to increase the chances of capsizing the ship by punching holes higher up in the hull. A few minutes later, she turned south, exposing her entire side to the submarine, which was heading due east. The escorting destroyer on that side passed right over Archerfish without detecting her. At 3:15 Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes before diving to 400 feet to escape a depth charge attack from the escorts. 4 of the 6 torpedoes struck the Shinano at an average depth of 4.27 meters. The first torpedo struck Shinano towards the stern, flooding refrigerated storage compartments and one of the empty aviation gasoline storage tanks. The detonation also killed many of the sleeping engineering personnel in the compartments above. The second torpedo hit the compartment where the starboard outboard propeller shaft entered the hull and flooded the outboard engine room. The third torpedo hit further forward, flooding the number 3 boiler room and killing every man on watch. Structural failures caused the 2 adjacent boiler rooms to flood as well. The fourth and final torpedo flooded the starboard air compressor room, the adjacent anti-aircraft gun magazines, and number 2 damage control station, and ruptured the adjacent oil tank. Sinking. Though severe, the damage to Shinano was at first judged to be manageable. The crew were confident in the ship's armor and its strength, which translated into lax efforts to save the ship initially. This overconfidence extended to Abe. He knew that American torpedoes were inferior to their Japanese counterparts, leading him to believe that the sub's torpedoes would not inflict any substantial damage on his ship. With this in mind, he ordered the carrier to maintain full speed even after the last torpedo hit. Extensive flooding caused the carrier to list 10 degrees to starboard within a few minutes. Despite pumping 3,000 long tons of water into the port bilges, the list increased to 13 degrees. When it became apparent that the damage was more severe than first thought, Abe ordered a change of course towards Shinano Point. Progressive flooding increased the list to 15 degrees by 0330. 50 minutes later, Abe ordered the empty port outboard tanks to be counter-flooded, reducing the list to 12 degrees for a brief time. After 0500 he ordered the civilian workers to be transferred to the escorts as they were impeding the crew in their duties. A half hour later, Shinano was making 10 knots with a 13-degree list. At 6 o'clock her list had increased to 20 degrees after the starboard boiler room flooded, at which point the port trimming tank's valves rose above the waterline and became ineffective. The engines shut down for lack of steam around 0700, and Abe ordered all of the propulsion compartments evacuated an hour later. He then ordered the 3 outboard port boiler rooms flooded in a futile attempt to reduce the carrier's list. He also ordered kamikaze and isokais to take her in tow. However, the 2 destroyers only displaced 5,000 metric tons between them, barely a fraction of Shinano-Euro's displacement and not nearly enough to overcome her dead weight. The first tow cables snapped under the strain and the second attempt was aborted for fear of injury to the crews if they snapped again. The ship lost all power around 0900 and was now listing over 20 degrees. At 10:18, Abe gave the order to abandon ship. By this time Shinano had a list of 30 degrees. As she heeled her flight deck touched the water, which flowed into the open elevator well, sucking many swimming sailors back into the ship as she sank. A large exhaust vent below the flight deck also sucked many other sailors into the ship as it submerged. At 10:57 Shinano finally capsized and sank stern first at coordinates, 65 miles from the nearest land, in approximately 4,000 meters of water, taking 1,435 officers, men and civilians to their deaths. The dead included Abe and both of his navigators, who chose to go down with the ship. Rescued were 55 officers and 993 petty officers and enlisted men, plus 32 civilians for a total of 1,080 survivors. The survivors were isolated on the island of Mizukojima until January 1945 after their rescue to suppress the news of the carrier's loss. The carrier was formally struck from the Naval Register on August 31. U.S. naval intelligence did not initially believe in Wright's claim to have sunk a carrier. Shinano-Euro's construction had not been detected through decoded radio messages or other means, and the American analysts believed that they had located all of Japan's surviving carriers. Wright was eventually credited with sinking a 28,000 long-ton Hayate carrier by the acting commander of the Pacific Fleet Submarine Force on the basis of a drawing Wright submitted depicting the ship he had attacked. The Americans only learned about the existence of Shinano after the war. Following this discovery Wright was credited with her sinking and awarded a Navy Cross. Post-war analysis of the sinking. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan noted that Shinano had serious design flaws. Specifically, the joint between the waterline armor belt on the upper hull and the anti-torpedo bulge on the underwater portion was poorly designed. Archerfish's torpedoes all exploded along this joint. The force of the torpedo explosions also dislodged an I-beam in one of the boiler rooms which punched a hole into another boiler room. In addition, the failure to test for water tightness in each compartment played a role as potential leaks could not be found and patched before Shinano put to sea. The executive officer blamed the large amount of water that entered the ship on the failure to air test the compartments for leaks. He reported hearing air rushing through gaps in the watertight doors just minutes after the last torpedo hit a sign that seawater was rapidly entering the ship, proving the doors were unseaworthy. See also: List by death toll of ships sunk by submarines, notes. References: Blair, Clay. Silent Victory, The U.S. Submarine War Against Japan. Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute Press. ISBN A1-55750-217 Exer, Brown, David. WWII Fact Files, Aircraft Carriers. New York, Arco Publishing. ISBN A0-668-04164-1. Campbell, John. Naval Weapons of World War II. Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute Press. ISBN A0-87021-459-4. Chesno, Roger. Aircraft Carriers of the World, 1914 to the Present, an Illustrated Encyclopedia. Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute Press. ISBN A0-87021-902-2. Enright, Joseph F. and Ryan, James W. Shinano. The Sinking of Japan's Secret Supership. New York, St. Martin's Press. ISBN A0-312-00186-X. Garsk, William H. and Dulin, Robert O. Battleships, Axis and Neutral Battleships in World War II. Annapolis, Maryland, Naval Institute Press. ISBN A978-0-87021-101-0. Holtzeth, E.C., Commander. Reports of the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan, Ship and Related Targets. Article 2, Yamato, B.B., Musashi, B.B., Taiyo, C.V., Shinano, C.V. United States Navy. Retrieved April 28, 2013. Gentstura, Hans-Georg. Jung, Dieter and Mikkel, Peter. Warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 1869–1945. Annapolis, Maryland, United States Naval Institute. ISBN A0-87021-893-X. Preston, Anthony. The World's Great Aircraft Carriers. London, Brown Books. ISBN A1-897884-58-3. Silverstone, Paul H. Directory of the World's Capital Ships. New York, Hiocrene Books. ISBN A0-88254-979-0. Still, Mark. USN Carriers vs. IJN Carriers, The Pacific 1942. Dual 6. Oxford, UK, Osprey Publishing. ISBN A978-84603-248-6. Tully, Anthony Pijn Shinano, Tabular Record of Movement. Kyoto Butai. CombinedFleet.com. Retrieved June 16, 2013. A.